Welcome, and as we at Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors continue to celebrate our 20th anniversary of creating thoughtful and effective philanthropy, I thank you for joining us for the launch webinar of RPA's second biennial Global Trends and Strategic Time Horizons in Philanthropy Survey Report. I'm Renee Karibi-White, and I head up RPA's Communications and Thought Leadership, along with my colleagues Olga Tarasov, who's the Director of Knowledge Development, and Caroline Swazi, who's the Content and Thought Leadership Specialist. Assisting on the back end is our colleague James Yeagley as well, so thanks in advance, James. Next slide. During today's webinar, I'm going to provide a bit of background on RPA and this topic area. Then Olga and Caroline are going to take us through key points from the survey, including the respondent profile, general findings, and then those specific to the issue of strategic time horizons. At the conclusion, we'll answer as many questions as we can fit in. So please go ahead and post them in the Q&A, post them in either in the Q&A or send as a message to us as panelists. So before we get started, I'm going to share a bit of background about RPA for those of you who might be unfamiliar with our organization. Born out of the legacy of John D. Rockefeller's then highly innovative approach to philanthropy, we were founded 20 years ago as a nonprofit with the goal of helping donors create thoughtful and effective philanthropy. We are firm believers that philanthropy can help create a better world, and we're committed to learning and to sharing the knowledge to make that happen. We are a global organization with offices and core staff worldwide, including Europe, Nigeria, New York, Chicago, as well as San Francisco. Today, our mission at RPA is to accelerate philanthropy for a just world. We do that through a variety of means, including providing direct services to families, foundations, corporations, and other philanthropies, doing fiscal sponsorship. In fact, we host or incubate over 100 projects currently, and most relevant to today, engaging in global research, thought leadership, and donor education. Next slide. Our thought leadership includes a variety of publications, tools, learning cohorts, and more. And we also cover a wide range of topics on philanthropic practice, as well as key substantive issue areas. Strategic time horizons is one of those areas. You can go to the next slide. For those unfamiliar with the term, strategic time horizons is the length of time of philanthropy, is the length of time over which a donor or foundation seeks to engage in philanthropic giving. The selected time horizon can be in perpetuity, meaning there's no end date foreseen, or it can be time limited, which is defined by a predetermined end date or triggering event. When deciding to give as much as possible, as fast as possible, or deciding to limit giving to a rate that enables an in perpetuity existence, intentionality around a time horizon can increase a donor's effectiveness and sharpen its focus. With the welcome support of Atlantic Philanthropies, we believe this is an important area of research and insight because regardless of the issue being supported, the selected time horizon has profound strategic and operational implications for the organization, its grantees, as well as those it seeks to benefit. So the strategic time horizon will influence and be influenced by what the organization does, how it gets it done, who the organization works with, the way the organization's work is sustained. And it's our hope that donors become intentional about evaluating their appropriate strategic time horizon by engaging in a deliberate balancing act among all considerations. Our resources on strategic time horizons to help donors with this analysis include a 2-volume guide with very practical guidance in the fashion of RPA's philanthropy roadmap style, which many of you may be familiar with, as well as a robust publication featuring case studies on philanthropies that were in fact very intentional about their strategic timelines. Specifically relevant to today's webinar, we also have 2 reports from 2020, which were our inaugural research surveys in this area, that highlight reasons for giving, causes, and more in the context of strategic time horizons. The first one, entitled Global Trends and Strategic Time Horizons in Family Philanthropy, was created in partnership with Camden Wealth out of the UK. And that report reflects findings from a survey and interviews with over 200 ultra-high net worth families engaged in philanthropy. The second one, which the one today is a follow-on from, is Strategic Time Horizons, a global snapshot of foundation approaches, which we conducted in collaboration with Newark University of Chicago. And that one focused on foundation giving based on the responses of 150 organizations around the world. So today's survey is a continuation of that research.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Thank you, Renee, for the introductions and the wonderful framing of the history and genesis of our work at RPA and this particular research. I'm delighted to tell you more about this work and what we sought to achieve with it and the main findings. Before diving into data, perhaps it will be useful to say a few words about what we sought to accomplish by conducting the second biannual survey and what we hope the findings will contribute to the world and practice of philanthropy. As this is the only global survey of its kind, by conducting its second iteration, we really wanted to create comparative data or start creating comparative data and benchmarks for important data points it captures, particularly on flows of money, strategic time horizons, and how they impact strategic and operational choices made by funders, motivations and top causes supported globally, influencing factors in decision-making, and next-generation engagement in family philanthropy, as well as other existing and emerging trends and practices in global philanthropy. Notably, we also wanted to provide a snapshot of how the challenges that shook the world immediately after our 2020 survey reports were published impacted philanthropic giving. These are all important insights, and as we conduct more of these surveys, a fuller picture of the jigsaw puzzle that is global philanthropy will emerge. This will not only allow us to harvest and continue sharing new insights and comparative analysis, we also hope that our ongoing research and work will contribute to informing strategic decision-making, not just for funders, but for the broader philanthropic ecosystem, including grantees, partner organizations, and communities served. However, it is also very important to note that this is not a representative survey, and the number of respondents, their demographic nature, and organization types are not directly comparable to the data in the last set of survey reports. As we conduct more of these studies and collect a library of data, we will be able to produce a more robust cross-analysis and identify existing or emerging trends with greater clarity and certainty. Next slide, please. Next one, thank you. The second survey produced a lot of interesting findings, so let's dive right in to some of them. First, who were our respondents? We're proud to say that the second survey significantly expanded its geographic reach, and it represents 150 participants from 30 countries on 6 continents. 33% of our respondents hailed from North America, 28 from Europe, 18 from Central and South America, 16 from Asia Pacific, and 3% from Africa. We also have a 1% representation from the Middle East. There was a range in terms of the age of responding organizations. About a quarter of our respondents were established before 1980, and the majority were established in the 2000s or later. Interestingly, most respondents from Asia Pacific and North America were established in the 21st century, while most organizations from Central, South America, and Europe were established before the year 2000. Next slide, please. 79% of responding organizations were grant makers, either fully or as a mixed grant making and operating philanthropic entity. 15% of organizations reported being fully operating foundations. Most of the responding organizations self-reported as endowed foundations, and there was also a significant diversity of endowment sizes among the participating organizations, ranging from less than 5 million to more than 1 billion. Grant-making budgets ranged as well from less than $5 million to greater than $100 million. In terms of staff, almost all respondents reported having full-time staff dedicated to philanthropy. The most common ranges of staff numbers were up to 10 staff or between 11 to 40 and 49 staff. 19% of respondents reported having more than 100 employees.
So before we dive into the overall key findings and salient insights from this report, I just want to go back to something that Olga said about the timing right after our January 2020 report. So since then, the world has dramatically changed. The COVID-19 pandemic, political turbulence, increased recognition of systemic inequities, and a growing focus on social justice have all played a part in creating significant social shifts. And as we all know, philanthropy has been no exception and has been transformed. So James, if you could just head to the next slide. The responses to this survey help illuminate how and why philanthropic organizations make important decisions, and that includes those about funders' philanthropic timelines. What we found as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic is half of respondents said that the challenges faced due to the COVID-19 pandemic and other events during 2020 to 2021 influenced their philanthropic timelines. 34% reported an acceleration of their philanthropic giving without formally changing their strategic time horizons, which I think is really interesting because it shows that even if organizations don't decide to make the shift, and even if they're not in conversations about it yet, they really are thinking, how can we address the urgent challenges that the world is facing now? And then we also have 12% of organizations that said that they actually did decide to start these strategic conversations about altering their spending timeline because of these events. And then just taking a look at the regional distinctions, more than half of respondents from Africa, North America, and Central and South America said that they have at least considered changing their philanthropic timelines due to the COVID-19 pandemic and related challenges. And if we just head to the next slide. So if we take a look at the global snapshot of funding flows, you see that no matter the cause or the philanthropic timeline, when it comes to giving, organizations tend to keep at least some of their funding in their own region. Out of the 4 regions that we surveyed, at least 90% of all organizations in that region gave to their own region. So just to explain what that means a little bit more, you see that the Asia Pacific tops that list with 100% of organizations giving at least some funding within the Asia Pacific. That doesn't mean that they give 100% of funding, but it means that at least some funding is going into the Asia Pacific region, with then 9% going to North America, 9% to the Middle East, 9% to Europe, 13% to Africa, and so on. And then if we just head to the next slide, we can dive into some of the motivations for giving and top causes. So among all of the regions surveyed, influencing social change and giving back were the top motivations for philanthropic giving. And then if you want to take a look at more of the top motivations broken down by region, take a look inside of our report and you'll see that there are some slight variances. For example, again, in the Asia Pacific region, to putting values into action gets a little bit higher up on this list. But really overall, when asked about the main motivations behind giving, the top things were influencing social change, giving back to society, addressing urgent needs, and putting values into action. Regardless of motivations and variances in regional funding, all of these areas agreed that education remains a top priority. As you can see in the diagram on the right, this was consistent among more than half of the organizations surveyed across all regions. Instead of focusing on a single issue, you'll also see that the vast majority of respondents supported more than one program area. So education was the top tier, but then you also see community and economic development as one of the leading 2 causes in every region except for Europe, where it stood in 3rd place behind education and health. And then the survey did, yes, so then if we go to the next slide, actually. Okay, thank you. So the survey did reveal that funders measure effectiveness in different ways, but the main way was through evaluation of the entire program and or initiatives, or through an evaluation of individual grants. You'll see that very few organizations didn't measure their philanthropic work at all, or by doing formal assessments or surveys of grantee satisfaction. And then I will hand it back over to Olga.
Thank you. In the survey, we also took a closer look at the inner workings of family-led and corporate philanthropies, how they give, how they make decisions, and how they engage their family members or employees. We had 48 family-led philanthropies participating in the survey. Most of these organizations were led by one generation, and 35% reported that at least two generations of family members were involved in the oversight of the family's philanthropic management. For a majority, the second generation of the family managed the family's philanthropy, and a smaller share of 12% were managed by the fourth or later generations. Next slide, please. Most family-led organizations surveyed reported very active involvement among next generation family members, with only 13% reporting that the next generation was not involved in philanthropy at all. Family-led organizations used a number of approaches to encourage engagement in families' philanthropy. These included instilling philanthropic values and a sense of moral responsibility, creating opportunities to transfer intergenerational knowledge and experience, and educating the next generation about world challenges. Interestingly, 8% of respondents did not actively encourage the next generation's engagement. Next slide, please. In terms of corporate giving, our 17 corporate respondents constituted a smaller, but still very significant and informative demographic of the survey. Corporate respondents engaged in a range of philanthropic efforts. More than half operated their own programs within their industry sector or communities, conducted grant making within their industry sector or communities, or ran volunteer programs. 29% implemented operating programs outside of their particular industry, or they delivered pro bono services. In terms of where philanthropy resides in corporate structures, 71%, the vast majority of respondents, said their philanthropic entity had a legal structure separate and distinct from the corporation, and 29% said their philanthropy was a part of the corporate social responsibility program. Main decision makers of philanthropic strategy were cited as executive staff and or the board of directors. Fewer participants said strategic decisions were guided by the founder, philanthropic advisors, communities served, family members, or regulatory bodies. In terms of the main motivations driving corporate giving, these also varied. 76% of respondents said they wanted to give back to society, and a slightly lower percentage, 71%, said they wanted to influence social change. Just over half said they wanted to put their values into action, and almost half said they had a moral obligation to engage in philanthropy. One interesting data point is that 6% said they, respectively, said they engaged in philanthropy to counteract past harmful effects of their industry, for tax considerations, or out of legal responsibility. And over to you, Caroline.
And over to me as I'm muted. Thank you. So as we kick off the findings in this report that are directly related to strategic time horizons in philanthropy, I just want to go back to what Renee said in the beginning. This is the only global survey of this kind on this topic. And I think that a big part of that is because people weren't really talking about this before, and we're seeing interest continue to grow over time. We're really proud of the robust body of work we've created over the past few years, including 2 additional survey reports, 2 donor guides, and a library of case studies. And we'll share the link to those at the end of this presentation. So throughout this time, our research has consistently shown that while the in perpetuity model does continue to stay dominant, kind of the default, time-limited giving and considering time-limited giving continues to grow, especially in organizations established more recently after the 1990s. We've seen a growing interest in time-limited giving, either by switching to time-limited giving, considering switching, or even starting off as a time-limited organization to begin with. If you see the bottom figure here, there's a little bit more of an in-depth breakdown, and among organizations that are time-limited, the 16%, you'll see that 10% are established as time-limited, whereas 6% make the switch. And then if we go on to the next slide, please. For another regional breakdown, you can see that in between 70 and 80% are still really not considering it, but we do see a growing number of organizations that are having the conversation or are time limited. And I think that what this shows is that philanthropy is continuing to become more thoughtful and more strategic about the approach that they're taking. So then if we head to the next slide. Some different determinants of time horizons include the founder's intent, past practices. Some organizations take into account a set of bylaws or articles of incorporation. And then for many, including businesses, the strategic time horizons model is completely undefined. But I know that there was a question already about family-led philanthropy and independent or privately endowed foundations. And we do see that there's a larger percentage there where the founder's intent does determine that. And then, so for main influencers of time horizons decisions, maybe unsurprisingly, among organizations that have adopted a time-limited model, the founder of the organization and the board of directors were the most influential voices in this decision, but also the executive staff and the influence of family members does also play a role. For some organizations, we also see that philanthropic advisors, some community served, or something else influenced the decision. Something that I want to call back to here is that there's not one right answer for these decision makers. It's all about really taking the time to be strategic and going through the process and having these conversations. And then just taking a deeper look at the causes and issues, kind of similar to what we were talking about before. Education does continue to be the dominant area of interest for time-limited organizations, perpetual organizations, and organizations that are considering the time-limited model. Community and economic development are also a close second. So one notable difference that we saw here is that political, civil, and human rights were cited as the third lead area of programmatic focus among organizations considering a time-limited model, fourth for time-limited respondents, and fifth for in perpetuity organizations. The reason why this is interesting is because they were not in the top 5 for any of the areas of interest in our 2020 survey. So this significant change was really an outlier for us, even though the sample size was different. Just going from not being in the top 5 at all to showing up in the top 3 to 5 is a change. So we think that this change potentially could reflect how philanthropy is responding to societal changes of 2020 and 2021, and even the societal changes that we've seen just as a whole over the past decade or so. And if we just head to the next slide, thank you. So main motivations for engaging in philanthropy were similar, also among respondents adhering to different strategic time horizons. Across time-limited organizations, those considering the time-limited approach at the time of this survey, and those who had not considered or decided against a time-limited model, had their top motivations cited as giving back to society, influencing social change, addressing urgent need, and putting values into action. For organizations that were currently considering a time-limited model, to leave a legacy was also tied as that third. Something I want to point out here is that on those currently considering a time-limited model, you see giving back to society really spiking all the way up to 89%, higher than any of the other percentages. And a possible finding from that is that these organizations that are taking the time to strategically decide whether or not their philanthropic timeline should be limited or not are really thinking, what is the most effective way that we can give back to society now? Is it by continuing in perpetuity, or is it by stopping at a certain defined timeline? And then over to you, Olga. Thank you.
Thank you. So as part of this in-depth exploration of strategic time horizons in philanthropy, we also surveyed respondents' perspectives on the implications and benefits of strategic time horizons, including the reason organization chose to adopt or switch to a time-limited model or remain in perpetuity, and how those choices impacted the effectiveness of their work, as well as the driving factors behind their decisions. Of the 21 philanthropic organizations that adopted a time-limited model, 43% did so to make a greater impact by narrowing their programmatic, geographic, or demographic focus. 1/3 wanted to see the impact of efforts during the founder's lifetime. Almost a quarter, respectively, adopted this horizon due to an urgent need or opportunity, a decline in financial resources, and a desire to allow future generations to determine their own philanthropic path. Only 14% of organizations adopted time-limited philanthropy out of concern that future generation of family members would not want to be involved in the organization's philanthropic activity, or that those future activities would not align with the donor's intent. Next slide, please. Among the 11 respondents considering a switch, the vast majority cited a desire to make greater impact by narrowing focus as well. Other reasons included an expectation to allow future generations to determine their own philanthropic interests or approaches. One notable finding here is that 36% of these respondents also cited as a reason for considering spending down a decline in financial resources. And this is a notable difference from the previous surveys in which no respondent mentioned declining financial resources as a reason for considering a switch. So this is, again, one of those outliers that Caroline mentioned earlier that might signify a trend or might signify a connection to the turbulence of 2020, 2021. Next slide, please. When asked about factors that prevented the organizations from switching to a time-limited model, the vast majority said they believed that their work required an ongoing long-term commitment or presence. 30% of organizations reported that this was due to a desire to engage future generations of the founder's family in philanthropy. Next slide, please. In terms of challenges, organizations that became time limited dealt with a variety of barriers in that process. The most common ones included engaging funding partners to continue the work after they exited, lack of alignment among family members, board leadership and staff, and financial management. Next slide, please. Nonetheless, all organizations reported that the switch to time-limited philanthropy improved the effectiveness of their work in at least some way. In fact, many organizations reported that adopting a time-limited horizon led to improved operational efficiency. Nearly half said that it led to a greater strategic clarity and focus, and 38% said they worked with greater urgency, and 33% said their work aligned more with the donor or founder's intent. And then 29% of that demographic actually said that led them to work more closely with grantees and communities served. Next slide, please. Outside of time-limited respondents, all respondents to the survey viewed both the time-limited and in perpetuity models as effective. More than 8 in 10 agreed or strongly agreed that organizations that are time-limited in nature work with greater urgency, and that they were more likely to spend their resources according to the donor's philanthropic intent. In terms of the in perpetuity model, more than 9 in 10 respondents said that the in perpetuity model enabled future generations of family members to participate in the foundation's work. And more than 8 in 10 said that the model enabled social impact over multiple generations and allowed for agility and adaptation to changes in societal needs over time. And I think with that, we've covered all of the leading findings of the survey report. And I'll hand over the virtual mic back to Renee for questions and remarks.
Thanks, Olga and Caroline, for that overview. So before we dive into some of the questions, I just want to give you a little bit of background about how we work. We are a very collaborative organization, and we view that the clients that we work with often have very good perspectives that we appreciate, that we value from, that we benefit from, and then we share out. So any questions that you have, we would love to hear them. This data is very, very robust, and we look forward to delving into it more over the next coming months to do even more data cuts and see what kinds of information is most relevant and beneficial for the sector. So we have 3 questions right now. So the first one is around whether family or non-family board members are more willing or less willing to consider either moving to a limited life structure or starting a new foundation utilizing limited life versus perpetuity, and what the survey shows on that.
So I can start that answer. The survey report as is doesn't really go into depth on that question. We're still analyzing some data related to family philanthropy, and we'll be posting more articles and content on that in the coming months. Quite frankly, our survey did not address the question of whether or not they're more willing to consider those questions. Anecdotally, however, through our past work on compiling the case studies of foundations who are engaged in family philanthropies, that is certainly a point of tension. One of the foundations that we profiled in the case studies really went through a turbulent strategic period where family members were very much split between those who wanted to remain in perpetuity and those who really wanted to address urgent needs now. And the decision was that those that wanted to spend down decided to spend down this particular foundation within 10 years. And the remaining portion of the board and family members decided to spin off new in perpetuity organizations that would cover the causes that they were passionate about as long as their endowments were growing and active.
Thanks, Olga. The next question is around younger generations. Did we find that younger generations were considering actively spending down their endowments more than the older generations? I can take this one. So we haven't broken down the data based on family philanthropy specifically yet. However, that is an area we're going to delve more into. What we can say, and this is what we know from all of the other work that we do, is that younger generations are deploying their assets in ways much more broadly than prior generations. They are leveraging all of the tools that they have in their toolbox to help make the change. So we have found that younger generations tend to be more likely to consider alternate approaches than the standard philanthropic model. So we would expect to see that be more of a difference and distinction as the younger generations end up being more of a higher number of the generations managing philanthropy. As Olga pointed out, with 54% of the organizations we surveyed currently managed by the second generation, 38% are the third generation. So as we go down in generations and more Gen Xers and millennials become the foundation leaders, we fully expect to see more organizations be very intentional about this approach.
And I just want to also add one factor. It doesn't directly link to younger generations of families. However, we did note that younger organizations that were established later on are more likely to consider time-limited philanthropy or accelerating their spending. So that also might be linked to the younger generations of family. Again, we're still analyzing that data, but that is a finding that says to us that yes, younger generations, whether of foundations or families, are more willing to consider innovative and new approaches and depart from default thinking.
Thanks.
If you're more interested in that breakdown, I was just going to say the same graphic, Olga. It's right on page 19 of our report. So if you download it after, you can see it.
Great. The next question is whether any of the organizations surveyed, particularly in the United States, gave to financial inclusion causes. And I can answer this one pretty easily. So we didn't break down financial inclusion as a subcategory. However, 45% of respondents gave to community and economic development, of which financial inclusion is a subcategory. Anyone want to add to that?
Nope, that was my answer as well. So you captured it.
The next question is, did you get the sense that growing discomfort with concentrations of wealth and other philosophical, moral, social justice concerns drive consideration of time limitation?
A very interesting philosophical question. One answer concerns the survey, and we did not touch upon that, although there are certain findings that perhaps can lead us to that conclusion, one of which being that political and social and political, civil, and human rights are rising in terms of hierarchy of causes supported. But also we can point to the fact that more organizations are reacting to the urgency of now, and the urgency of now is oftentimes related to social justice, equity, and equality issues globally. Anecdotally, I think I would say most organizations that have recently decided to spend down because of the political, socioeconomic turbulence, and the desire to address racial justice issues in the United States, they decided to spend down post 2016. So that also points to the fact that that consideration, I'm not sure as to the philosophical struggle with the concentration of wealth, but response to the socioeconomic inequities and historic injustices is a motivating factor. Anecdotally, I think the growing traction for resource justice, especially as a point of discussion and action among younger generation, points to the fact that that philosophical question is on the rise. However, I don't think it is the majority of even spend down foundations, but that's anecdotal and not related to that survey.
Thanks, Olga. Another question is whether there is specific data around staffing sizes for time-limited foundations based on endowment size.
Well, we do have that raw data. So that is, again, there are a lot of data cuts that did not make it into this report, but that is a cross-reference that we can and will do in the future analysis that we release on the survey. The data we collected is so rich that it was really hard to fit it all into one report and make it readable. And so we will continue to release some of the most interesting data, including this, in the future.
I feel like this Q&A is giving us great ideas for follow-ups on this report.
Definitely. I also want to, just to add to what Olga said about that, one of the guides do go into a little bit about the staffing size and winding down. So that might be a resource for insight, if not statistics. All right, are there any other questions? Oh, we did have one additional question. How can we compare the 2020 findings to these findings? Are they comparable? Should we look at them? How can we look at them in comparison to each other?
So I can start this one, and the rest of the team can fill in. As I said in the beginning of my presentation, my portion of the presentation, they're not directly comparable, unfortunately. You know, we are learning as we go along with our statistical analysis and survey development. These were different regional spreads, geographic spreads. These were different types of organization, different demographic types and nature. And so there's no direct comparison. However, there were certain outliers among findings that were so standard among all the surveys and among all the respondents, that the fact that there are outliers leads us to believe that there are potentially trends. And so the more surveys we conduct, and there will be more biannual surveys on this topic and on these questions, and the more data we collect, the more confidence we will have to say that something is a trend or not. But unfortunately, these two samples are not comparable yet, but we will be able to make certain cross-analyses and cross-references the more surveys we conduct in the future.
Okay, I think that wraps up all the questions that we have. We are going to send out the survey to everyone who attended this webinar or registered for the webinar. This session was in fact also recorded. So once we send out the follow-up email, you'll have the chance to forward it to anyone else who may benefit from it. And please always feel free to visit our website, rocpa.org. We have a knowledge center that is chock full of useful information on a wide variety of issues affecting philanthropy. And the specific page on this particular issue is the Strategic Time Horizons URL. So thank you again for attending and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.